Hello everyone, and welcome to this session in which we're going to discuss a segment of the CAT 2023. Now, if this is the first time you're watching a video like this with us, please remember that the purpose is to actually give you an idea of what this exam was like, what the questions were like, what the solutions to those questions would be, and how we go about arriving at it. The objective really is to give you a sense of how you need to kind of not just deal with the exam, but what you'd probably need to do to prepare to handle an exam of this kind. So, without much more, let us say, prior discussion, let's get into the paper itself. So, we are looking at CAT of 2023. We're looking at the first slot. There will obviously be another video as well because there were two slots. So, we're looking at the first slot and we're looking at a specific segment, which is the what we call the verbal ability and the reading comprehension segment, which everyone likes to refer to as the English segment. But let's do remember that this segment is not merely about do you know English or do you not. It's actually about can you use it effectively? How well can you use your English? Very simply because they would like to test whether you can handle, let us say, the complexity of the program that you're going to attend, whether you can actually be effective in your communication, and so on and so forth. So, the segment typically gives you comprehension questions, which is what we call the questions that appear after passages. They would normally be, at least in CAT 23, and the pattern has been that we have 4 passages which have 4 questions each. And then you have verbal ability questions. These are what we name the ones that appear with paragraphs. So they give you single paragraphs which are either jumbled or incomplete, or you have to pick an odd statement out of the paragraph, or you have to find places where you fit sentences into a paragraph. So basically what we call the paragraph based questions, we call them verbal ability questions. Then there would be 8 of those. Now of these questions, let's remember that some of them, not all of them, some of them, maybe 4 or 5, would actually be questions that don't have choices, which means you come up with the answer, you put the answer in a box, which means you have to be absolutely exact in your interpretation and your thinking to be able to arrive at the absolutely correct solution. There are no marks for part solutions, you know that. So that's what the segment has, and we'll get started with what we have over here. In CAT 23, the RCs appeared first, which means you actually had all of them in sequence, 4 passages and 16 questions first, and then the paragraph type questions. So that is how it appears here also. But in dealing with this, we'll be doing it in the fashion in which it appears. But we'll also very briefly discuss whether that would have been, for instance, when we take up a particular passage or a particular set of questions, we will deal with it, but we will also look at it briefly first to understand whether in your priority of your attempts, would you have attempted this first, would you have left it, would you have done it later, and so on. So the idea is, while we are going to be doing it in the sequence in which it appears, we will also discuss what you could possibly have done to work out your sequence in terms of comfort levels that you have. So that's the idea behind this whole discussion. So let's get started then. We are actually looking at the first one, which is a RC passage. It has a passage, it has 4 questions. And even as you look at it, for instance, if you were looking at this, you would very quickly go down to the questions and ask, which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population? Which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? The inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except, and the last one being, the author presents an economic situation, a solution to an existing issue facing Lozère. So we know that we are talking about a particular place, some place called Lozère. We know that they have a problem. We know that the problem is actually related to wolves. So we know that the topic is actually going to be natural history plus, let us say, social impact. That is social on that means the impact of something in nature on societal life, right? So it shouldn't be too difficult to handle. Now that means I would possibly make an assessment of whether I want to handle it or not. This one doesn't seem to be difficult to handle. If it was difficult to handle, I would possibly have left it for later. But right now, we know that we can probably handle this even as the first passage that we get. So let's see. Residents of Lozère, a hilly department in southern France, and they actually mean a location, a district, recite complaints familiar to many rural corners of Europe. In remote hamlets and villages, which names such as Le Bacon and Le Baconvieux, mayors grumble about a lack of local schools, jobs, or phone and internet connections. Farmers of grazing animals add another concern. So that means there's one more problem that we're looking at, the return of wolves. Eradicated from France last century, the predators are gradually creeping back to more forests and hillsides. The wolf must be taken in hand, which is an idiom whereby you're saying you really must get control of it. The wolf must be taken in hand, said an aspiring parliamentarian, Francis Palombi, when presented by voters in an election campaign early this summer. Tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Lozère, but farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods, which means there is someone who's excited about the fact that there are wolves, namely tourists, but farmers are not, because the wolves attack their livestock and therefore threaten their livelihoods. As early as the 9th century, and by 9th century we mean 9th century AD, you know that, so we're talking about 801 to 900, the royal office of the Lupari, the wolf catchers, that means there were wolf catchers and they were created into an official department. The royal office of the Lupari, wolf catchers, was created in France to tackle the predators. Those official hunters and others, the others, namely, apart from the official hunters, other hunters also, the people who were not actually authorized. So those official hunters and others completed their job in the 1930s when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. So their job was to actually rid France of wolves, which they did. And you realize that this is information that confirms a statement already made. The statement already made was that they were eradicated from France in the last century. And this statement tells me when. So that actually happened, okay, by the 1930s. So those official hunters and others completed their job in the 1930s when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. Active hunting and improved technology, such as rifles in the 19th century, plus the use of poison, such as strychnine later on, caused the population collapse. That means this is how they did it. They either shot them or they poisoned them. But in the early 1990s, the animals reappeared. This also we've been told, right? We've been told earlier that they are coming back, isn't it? So they have another concern, the return of wolves. So we know that they're returning. They were eradicated, but they're returning. So the eradication part is given to us over here, but the return part is given here. Correct? So in the early 1990s, the animals reappeared. They crossed the Alps from Italy, and the Alps we know are the mountain range that actually borders northern Italy. They crossed the Alps from Italy, upsetting sheep farmers on the French side of the border. Wolves have since spread to areas such as Lozère, which is this location we started talking about, delighting environmentalists, that means delighting those who are actually hoping to protect nature, who see the predator's presence as a sign of wider ecological health. So they look at it as nature is somehow re-establishing herself. Farmers who say the wolves cause the death of thousands of sheep and other grazing animals are less cheerful. Again, this is a repetition of idea. We already have this idea given to us in the introduction, right? So farmers are less cheerful. They grumble that green activists meaning those who are environmentalists or wildlife protection conservationists and so on. So they grumble that green activists and politically correct urban types. Politically correct urban types means people in towns who actually believe that they should be sensitive to everything in nature, and they therefore would want to do things which actually serve nature and do not, let us say, do not upset anybody who's actually a naturalist. So they grumble that green activities and politically correct urban types have allowed the return of an old enemy. The ideas keep coming back, isn't it? There's not very much by way of a new idea. So you realize by now you've understood that all we've been told is that while wolves were once eradicated from France, they are now back, and we are looking at the particular situation of a place called Lozère, where farmers seem to have a problem with wolves. Okay. So various factors explain the changes of the past few decades. Rural depopulation is part of the story. So what is it that accounts for this? So one part of that, one reason for that is rural depopulation. That means people migrating from villages to cities or to towns. In Lozère, for example, farming and a once flourishing mining industry supported a population of over 140,000 residents in the mid-19th century. Today, the department has fewer, and department again means here, location, district, whatever. Today, the department has fewer than 80,000 people. That means as many as 60,000, almost half, have left, many in its towns. Okay, the department has fewer than 80,000, and most of those 80,000 are in the towns, not in the rural areas. As humans withdraw, forests are expanding. In France, between 1990 and 2015, forest cover increased by an average of 102,000 hectares each year as more fields were given over to trees. Now that, for environmentalists or for people who are actually interested in restoring nature, is good news, isn't it? Which means forests are expanding again. So forest cover increased by an average of 102,000 hectares each year as more fields were given over to trees. Now, nearly 1/3 of mainland France is covered by woodland of some sort. The decline of hunting as a sport, also a good thing, also means more forests fall quiet, which means humans are not there in the forest too much. By quiet here we mean not too much human activity. In the mid to late 20th century, over 2 million hunters regularly spent winter weekends tramping in woodland, seeking boars, birds and other prey. That means the forest used to be very active with hunters, but now hunting has gone down as a sport. So the forests are quiet, at least when it comes to human activity and hunting activity. Today, the Federation Nationale des Chasseurs, which is hunters, the national body, claims 1.1 million people hold hunting licenses, as against 2 million hunters in the mid 20th century. So now they claim, that means the National, let us say, Association of Hunters, claims 1.1 million people hold hunting licenses, though the number of active hunters is probably lower. So they say while people hold licenses, not all of them really hunt. It's probably even lower than that. The mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe, because hunting them is now forbidden, other than when occasional culls are sanctioned by the state, plus the efforts of NGOs to track and count the animals, also contribute to the recovery of wolf population, which means now you can't hunt them except when you're permitted to do so because of some risk that they might actually pose. So the mostly protected status plus the efforts of, let's say, non-governmental organizations to track and count the animals also contribute to the recovery of wolf populations. Fine. So that was a very easy passage, right? As the lupine population, and we know lupine means the wolf family, as the lupine population of Europe spreads westwards, okay, and we know westwards would mean further towards the coast bordering the Atlantic, right? As the lupine population of Europe spreads westwards, with occasional reports of wolves seen closer to urban areas, expect to hear more clashes between farmers and those who celebrate the predator's return. So as this happens, you can expect would mean, this is to the reader, isn't it? You can expect that there will be clashes between farmers who don't want the wolves and environmentalists who actually celebrate the fact that wolves are coming back. Farmers' losses are real, but are not the only economic story. Tourist venues such as parks where wolves are kept and the animal spread is discussed also generate income and jobs in rural areas. So the fact is, this clash is not just about the farmer's interest alone. It's also about the fact that with tourists, with wolves coming back, there will be more tourism, because places where people are interested in getting to know about wolves will actually get tourists. So there is also going to be an economic side to both, an economic aspect to that clash, which is the farmers, their economic aspect is that their livelihoods are being threatened, sheep are being eaten, but the tourism segment is happy because they'll actually get more tourists who want to, in some sense, either view or get to know about these animals. Very easy passage, okay, no difficulty at all. In fact, even as you went through those 4 question statements, you understand that it's probably going to be easy to handle. Now, we are asked which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population, which means this is a direct question. It's a question where the detail is already in the passage, and I recognize if you say has not contributed, it means 3 are reasons for the growth of the wolf population, 1 is not. And if I was careful with my reading, I can also already figure out what I remember of the reasons given to me. And if need be, I know where to go back. I know where it is discussed, but as it is, I might actually have an answer as I go through the choices. So, has not contributed. 1 is the shutting down of the Royal Office of the Lupari. Now, the shutting down of the Royal Office of the Lupari only means that the people who were supposed to, in some sense, eliminate wolves were not able to do their job. No, the fact is the shutdown happened after the wolves were eliminated. Let's remember that it says by 1930 the job was done. And if by 1930 the job was done, then the office would have shut down. Now, the point is, growing wolf population is how do they come back? So, what we really want to know is how did they come back? Now, they didn't come back because the royal office of the Lupari was shut down. Even if the department was closed or the particular official organization was closed, that doesn't stop other people from actually, in some sense, hunting wolves if they need to. But the fact is, the shutting down was not the reason for their coming back. The shutting down was the reason, the shutting down was a consequence of having completed the job of eliminating them. So, one cannot be the answer. A decline in the rural population, yes, we are told that there has been actually people have migrated from rural areas to towns and therefore woodlands have grown. So, a decline in the rural population, yes. The granting of protected status to wolves in Europe, yes, because we are told that now hunting them is prohibited except under specific sanctions. An increase in woodland forest cover area in Lozère, quite right. We've been told that all over France and in this area, forest cover is increased and human activity in forests have gone down, which means there is an attraction for animals. They can come back into forest. So, we know that 2, 3 and 4 are given to us as reasons, but not 1. So, 1 would be the exception over here. So, we now move to question 2. Now, that one says, which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? Now, this is what we call a reasoning question. And a reasoning question would be one where you're taking the author's opinion and recognizing how the person arrived at that opinion. And then if you're going to weaken it, you're saying your reasons might not always be justifiable, or your reasons might not always work, or your reasons don't add up to this particular argument that you have. What is the author's claim? The author's claim really is that wolves are coming back, and this is a good thing as far as environmentalists are concerned. It's not a good thing as far as farmers are concerned, but there is an economic side to, there is an economic aspect to both sides of that story. That is the author's situation, right? Now, what would weaken that? So, if you say the old mining sites of Lozère are now being used as grazing pastures for sheep, now that's not actually talking about the fact that wolves are coming back. The claim is that wolves are coming back, and it's a good thing for environmentalists, it's not a good thing for farmers. But wolves are coming back. So, to weaken that, if you say that would weaken the author's claims, and the author's claims would be that tourists actually welcome the return, farmers don't. So, the old mining sites of Lozère are now being used as grazing pastures for sheep. That doesn't matter. The old mining sites are now grazing pastures for sheep. Does not talk about, let's say, the wolf population. So, we don't need to look at one. Wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise, which means the author has told us that environmentalists are happy. For them, it's a good thing. People would actually flock to areas where they could actually view or get to know about wolves. But if wolves are attacking tourists, then that means not only the farmers are going to be unhappy, but tourists are also going to be unhappy about the increased population of wolves. Whereas the author is saying tourists are happy. Tourists and environmentalists are happy about the increasing population. But if this was true, then tourists and let us say environmentalists would not be happy. So, this would actually in some sense weaken what the author is saying. What about 3? Unemployment concerns the residents of Lozère. That's unemployment. It's not to do with the wolf population. And then, having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Lozère. That doesn't weaken the author's claim. That is the author's claim. The author says that they were eliminated, but now they're coming back, which is what 4 tells us. 4 is only a restatement of the claim. The point is the author's claims. Let's understand what the author's claims were. The author claimed that wolves are coming back, claimed that farmers were not happy about it, claimed that environmentalists and tourists were happy about it. But if I'm told anything that questions any one of these statements, and I don't have anything here that questions are wolves coming back, I don't have anything here that questions are farmers unhappy, but I do have something here that questions are tourists happy. And tourists, if they are being attacked by wolves, are not going to be happy. So, which means 2 is what weakens that claim of the author. Okay. So, 2 is the answer to this question. Looking at the next one, the inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except, and this comes straight out of the passage. This tells you exactly what the passage says are the problems that they have. It was discussed in the first paragraph, because in the first paragraph it said there's this, that. In addition to that, farmers have a problem, which is wolves are coming back. So, what are the things that we have there? Let's just look at that, just to make sure that we are clear about it. So, we are saying there is a lack of schools, there is a lack of jobs, there is a lack of phone and internet connections, and there is also the return of wolves. So, I have all of that, correct? So, what we have here then? So we have poor rural communication infrastructure. Yes, because there's a lack of phone and internet connection. So that is actually what is the reason. Decline in the number of hunting licenses. Now, if you say decline in the number of hunting licenses, and you're talking about the fact that this is, let us say, um, one of the reasons that wolves have come back, right? So the point is, we talked about the return of wolves. And if you talk about the return of wolves, then decline in the number of hunting licenses has prompted the return of wolves because there are less hunters. So, or indicates there are less people who really want to hunt wolves. So, if there are less people who want to hunt wolves, then wolves are coming back, and then that's a problem that the inhabitants of Lozère have. So, which means we'll accept that also. It seems a little strange though, because you're saying, what do the decline of number of hunting licenses, that's not a problem for the people of Lozère. But we do know that the problem for the people of Lozère is the fact that wolves are coming back. And if wolves are coming back thanks to different features, then any one of those features is contributing to the problems of Lozère. And one of those features is the fact that hunting licenses are actually not being issued or not being asked for, or there are not enough people with it, and they are not even using it. And that would therefore mean less people are hunting, and therefore the wolf is actually coming back and troubling the people of Lozère. So we know that we possibly accept 2 as well, but let's just hold it there. Lack of educational facilities, we are told that. They don't have internet, they don't have proper schools, so that is there. Livestock losses, now they have to grapple with all of the following problems except, right? And it says livestock losses. Now what do we have here? We have the people of, let's say, so this gentleman, the residents of Lozère, they grumble about lack of local schools, right? Local schools, jobs, phone and internet connections, and farmers are talking about the return of wolves. Now, if we go down to it, you realize over here, we are saying they have to grapple with all the following problems except. Now, if we say except, then we know that over here, you've got poor rural communication infrastructure, we'll accept that, okay? Decline in the number of hunting licenses, therefore allowing wolves to actually increase, we'll accept that, okay? And then we have lack of educational facilities, it would seem like that we need to accept that. And then we have livestock losses, which is the farmers are actually losing their sheep because the wolves are coming back, we'll accept that. But then all of them seem as if they're okay. Then what's the exception? Now let's just look at each of them again. Now, if you look at decline in hunting licenses, right? The decline in hunting licenses is not actually in some sense. That's why we placed, if you remember, that's why we placed a mark here, which means it's something that we'd have to look at again. Why do we have to look at it again? Because what we are saying is that the whole business of over here, right? We've got the lack of local schools, we've got the lack of jobs, we've got the lack of phone internet connections, we've also got another concern, the return of wolves. Why the return of wolves? Because they actually are fretting over their livestock and their livelihoods, which means there's a loss of livestock. In which case, the business of not granting hunting licenses is actually, it's just let's say an area that tells you, or the absence of hunting licenses tells you that people aren't that interested in hunting anymore. Now, people not being interested in hunting anymore, does it have a direct impact on the people of Lozère as such? No, it doesn't have a direct impact on the people of Lozère. It has an impact on, let us say, are wolves being hunted, and it gives you a reason why wolves are coming back. But for the people in Lozère, the wolves are coming back. The problem with the wolves coming back is actually livestock losses. The cause of that problem. So this is not the problem. Decline in number of hunting licenses is not a problem. Decline in number of hunting licenses is something that might cause a problem. But therefore, what is the problem? The problem is the return of wolves. And what is the problem with the return of wolves? Livestock loss. So we've got to stay with this one, and this one then becomes a reason for this problem. It's a reason for this problem eventually. If you have a decline in number of hunting licenses, you have less people hunting wolves, you therefore have more wolves coming in, you therefore have livestock losses. So we got to look at this as their problem. This is not their problem, right? So 2 would be the answer to this question, right? So there is actually there's no way of saying that this is one of their problems. This is one of the reasons for how the problem has arisen. But the problem itself is wolves being around and eating up their livestock. So 2 then would be the answer to question 3. And moving forward to, let us say, moving forward to 4, what do we have? The author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Lozère that takes into account the divergent and competing interests of. Now, he presents a possible economic solution. Let's just look at where he presents the solution. He says, farmers' losses are real, but are not the only economic story. Tourist venues such as parks also generate income. In other words, he's saying, let's conserve the wolves, let's control them, conserve them, so that we do in some sense deal with the farmers. So you realize that that's probably what he's going to be suggesting. He's actually saying they are real, but they're not the only economic story. That means there's another economic story also. So if you have to deal with both economic stories, what we're really doing is we need to ensure that farmers are, in some sense, their livestock is protected, but we also need to make sure that we can make facilities available for tourists to actually, in some sense, come into contact with more that they want to know about wolves. So if you were to look at the choices here, he wants to take into account the competing interests of whom? Of both farmers and environmentalists. Farmers in terms of how should their livestock be protected, environmentalists in terms of what it is that we could do to ensure that wolves are protected, at least in certain areas as well. Now, environmentalists, politicians are not even discussed. Tourist environmentalists, no, he is clubbing tourists with environmentalists. And the other party is the farmer. Politicians and farmers, no, he's not even discussing politicians. So we know farmers, the ones who are actually suffering losses, environmentalists, the ones who are happy about it. And let's try and see that we come up with a solution that actually takes into account both of them. So the answer here would be 1. So that finishes this passage, and we can now move down to the next. So this one. And if I look at the questions, it tells me all of the following claims contribute to remapping discussed by the passage. I don't know what the remapping is. All of the following statements, if true, would weaken the passage claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels. Okay, so I know this is about English literature, but Indian Ocean novels would mean literature that is or English fiction, and especially sailing fiction. Okay, Indian Ocean novels, either sailing fiction or relating to the Indian Ocean area. Now, which one of the following statements is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean world? Okay, so it's the Indian Ocean area and migration there. And then on the basis of the nature of the relationship between the items, the pair below, choose the odd pair out. So 2 statements here tell me that we're dealing with fiction and we're dealing with the Indian Ocean area. And you know, the Indian Ocean area would mean all of, let's say, East Africa, all of, let's say, the southern part of the coastal part of the Middle East, and all of, let us say, the Indian Peninsula on its western side. Now, and then down to the south below Sri Lanka. So all these areas, right, would be the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean would therefore be sailing in the Indian Ocean, or it would be, let us say, the countries that actually, in some sense, are the coastal areas of the Indian Ocean. So I know that this passage is actually going to be about fiction related to that particular area. Would I like to try it? If I believe it's going to be complicated, but no, because you're talking about fiction related to a particular area, it's probably not going to be difficult. So fine, I would try it. So let's look at the passage itself. For early post-colonial literature, now I do need to know the term. Post-colonial will mean after the colonial era. Now we know the colonial era more or less ended by the middle of the 20th century, and there's literature after that. That means people have been writing after colonialism actually declined. The world of the novel was often the nation, which means people normally made their novels keeping a nation in mind, keeping a whole lot of people in mind. Post-colonial novels were usually concerned with national questions. Sometimes the whole story of the novel was taken as an allegory of the nation, whether India or Tanzania, which means the whole novel that was written post-colonial would be looked at as, let us say, representative of India, or let's say representative of Tanzania, both of which were once colonies but were now free. So this was important for supporting anti-colonial nationalism. But the fact is that the stories, if they were related to a nation, could actually be looked at as something supporting the business of nationalism against the colonial enterprise. But it could also be limiting. It could also be land-focused and inward-looking, which means you could also have something that while it was presenting the nation itself, it could also be saying that that's all we're doing. We're only presenting the nation. We're only looking at the nation. We're not looking at how the nation interacted with somebody else. So my new book, so obviously the person who's writing this is writing a book and is talking to you about his book or her book. My new book, Writing Ocean Worlds, explores another kind of world of the novel, not the village or nation, but the Indian Ocean world. That means everything around the Indian Ocean. The book describes a set of novels in which the Indian Ocean is at the center of the story. It focuses on the novelists Amitav Ghosh, Abdul Razak Guma, Lindsay Cole, and Joseph Conrad, who have centered the Indian Ocean world in the majority of the novels. Now, do remember, Indian Ocean world would mean all the countries which actually are around the Indian Ocean, or islands that might be in the Indian Ocean. So these people have actually centered on those areas. Their work reveals a world that is outward looking. So that means while the person says it could also be limited inward looking, he says actually there are those who are looking at something outward as well. Outward looking, full of movement, border crossing, and south-south interconnection. That means they talk about interactions between the countries in these worlds. They are all very different. From colonially inclined Conrad, okay, because Conrad was in some sense a person who believed that there was value in colonies, to radically anti-capitalist Colin. So that means you have a range of people here. You have those who supported colonialism and those who don't. But together, these people draw on and shape a wider sense of Indian Ocean space through themes, images, metaphors, and language. This has the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind. So as such, people who read these books get a much larger sense of it's not just my country, which is on the border of the Indian Ocean, or it's not just any country, it is actually the interconnection between all these countries. So this has shifted the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. Okay. The Indian Ocean world is a term used to describe the very long-lasting connections among the coasts of East Africa, the Arab coast, and South and East Asia. Okay, so we understood that. We talked about that earlier. I mean, basically, you know that you actually have Africa, and then you have Middle East, and then you have India, and then you have the rest of the islands, right down to Southeast Asia. So this then is your Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean world then talks about all these nations here and all of that. So where is that? Yeah. So here, the Indian Ocean world is a term used to describe the very long-lasting connections among the coasts of East Africa, the Arab coast, and South and East Asia. These connections were made possible by the geography of the Indian Ocean. For much of history, travel by sea was much easier than travel by land, which meant that port cities very far apart were often more easily connected to each other than to much closer inland cities. Since traveling by land was difficult and crossing terrain was difficult, and sometimes people didn't actually manage to do it. But traveling by sea, even distant ports could actually be connected more easily than, let us say, locations in the same land which were actually difficult to cross, difficult to traverse, right? So, for much of history, travel by sea was much easier than by land, which meant that port cities were very far apart, were often more easily connected to each other than to much closer inland cities. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that what we now call globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. This is the interconnected ocean world referenced and produced by the novels in my book. So this author is saying, in my book, this is what I've looked at. I've looked at all these different fictional stories that we have, which come from a wide variety of people, some who actually favored colonialism to the other extreme, people who didn't. But all of them talk about the travel between the countries of this world, of this Indian Ocean world, which is almost like a forerunner of what we now call globalization. And this is what my book is about. That's what he says. For their part, these writers he referred to earlier, Ghosh, Guma, Colin, and even Conrad, reference a different set of histories and geographies than the ones most commonly found in fiction in English. That means their fiction is very, very clearly centered in this area. Those commonly found ones, the commonly found books in English, are mostly centered in Europe or the US. They assume a background of Christianity and whiteness. That means people who are actually white, and mention places like Paris and New York. So that is what most fiction is like. But these novels, the novels in my book, highlight instead a largely Islamic space, feature characters of color, and centralize the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, and Bombay It's a densely imagined, richly sensory image of a southern cosmopolitan culture, which provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world. So, this, while most fiction actually centers itself on here, and people would therefore, in some sense, you would expect them to not see beyond those places. This set of fiction, the one the person is talking about here, is actually going to get them to understand that there is a much larger world, and that much larger world, the larger world includes the Indian Ocean world, which was also cosmopolitan in some sense. Richly sensory image of a world, a southern cosmopolitan culture, which provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world, which means while most fiction seems to center on Europe and the US, and people reading fiction seem to believe that, or seem to see a world that is there, Europe and the US, people who do read this fiction as well realize that there's a much larger world, and that much larger world is here in the East, in the Indian Ocean area, and this was also a cosmopolitan world. It actually had interconnected cultures, it had interconnected nations, and therefore it gives people, that means people who read this fiction, realize that the world is a much larger place than just Europe and the US, right? So we understand that. Moving forward, this remapping, that means this recognition that the world is a much larger place, is particularly powerful for the representation of Africa. That means, especially when it comes to Africa, people who read such fiction get a much better idea of Africa than they otherwise would have had. In the fiction, sailors and travelers are not all European, or they could also be African as well as Indian and Arab characters. These guys are traders, nakodas, those who captain dhow ships. You know what the dhow is? The dhow is your Arab sailing vessel, right? So it could be these people who are traders, nakodas, runways, villains, missionaries and other activities. They're not all European. This does not mean that Indian Ocean Africa is romanticized. So it doesn't mean that we've actually made it seem like this really wonderful, wonderful place. Migration is often a matter of force. It's often because people are compelled to migrate. Travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure. So in these books, travel is actually because people didn't want to travel, or because people were being sent out, or because people were being, in some sense, dismissed. So travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure. Freedoms are kept from women and slavery is rife. So in these books, let's say women, you get to understand that women are not as free as in the Western world. And slavery is rife. That means it's quite widespread. What it does mean is that the African part of the Indian Ocean world plays an active role in its long, rich history, and is therefore in that of the wider world. And therefore is in that of the wider world, which means when you do understand Africa through these novels that are part of the Indian Ocean world, you get to understand that Africa also has a rich history, sometimes positive, sometimes not. And therefore, its history is also part of the history of the wider world. So, not a very challenging passage to understand. It was just a question of, well, the first one was actually much easier. But while this was slightly more difficult, it was not difficult to the point where we struggled with it. You did understand what the person was saying. He was actually saying that the novels from this side of the world, or centered on this side of the world, allow readers to understand that the world is a much larger place than just Europe and the US, and allows them to understand the world, that this side of the world, that means what we call the Orient, also has a role to play in contributing to the history of the world in some sense. So, looking at the questions, all the following contribute to the remapping discussed in the passage except, right? Except. That means we know that this new idea we have about the world, or this improved idea we have about the world in the mind of the reader, is thanks to the novels that came out of this, that are centered on this, on the Orient, right? So, that remapping. So, I have three statements here that actually talk about the fact that people would understand the world to be a wider place, and one that is not. Indian Ocean novels have gone beyond the specifics of national concerns to explore rich regional paths. Quite right. It does say that you understand that there's a history and that there was interconnectedness, and this is the precursor or the forerunner of globalization. It tells us that. Then, the global south as opposed to the global north was the first center of globalization. That also we are told. We are told you, when you read these books, you realize that you already had something like globalization here, which is, and that's the global south, right? That means south of the equator. As opposed to, we thought that globalization was a Western kind of idea, but it was not. So we understand that. Cosmopolitanism originated in the West and traveled to the East through globalization. That's clearly wrong. The person says that this was already cosmopolitan. This area was already cosmopolitan in the sense that nations and cultures in some sense interacted with each other through different people. And this was the forerunner of globalization. So it's not that globalization brought cosmopolitanism to the East from the West. So this is very definitely out, very easy to pick. Then the East, the world of early international trade and commerce was not the sole domain of white Europeans. We are told that also. This remapping is, so there was actually trade and commerce that happened in the Indian Ocean world also. So we know that we will accept this. So the exception here is something that's actually a distortion, which is 3. So 3 is your answer to this question. Moving forward, all of the following statements, if true, would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels, except, now what the person told us is that mainstream English language fiction focused on Europe and focused on the US and focused on England. Those are the mainstream ones. But it's these novels, the one the person wants to talk about here, that actually focus on Indian Ocean. In other words, mainstream Indian English language fiction did not focus on Indian Ocean areas. So you want to weaken that. So 3 statements would weaken that. All the following statements, if true, would weaken that, except, now the if true would mean you consider them, if that was true, then it would weaken the author's claim. So most mainstream English novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and literature and adventure. That doesn't weaken the passage claim. In fact, the passage claims that most mainstream English language novels have privileged the Christian white experience of travel and adventure. So this is not weakening. So we are saying you want something that would weaken, but exception. So this is an exception. It's not going to weaken because the person really said that the English language fiction did not even bother about the Indian Ocean area. So most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and adventure, but it doesn't tell us that not in the Orient. Okay. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural crudeness. Right. Now, if it is true that the depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural crudeness. No, it's not imagination. The novels actually depict to you the actual truth. And the truth may be negative in some places, but you do also realize that there's a rich history there, a rich history about Africa. And the fact that that history is actually part of the history of the world. So, if this is true, because this is not what the person says, the person is actually telling us that it's not just imagination. The person presents to you reality, the African reality. So, it's not Orientalist imagination. So, if this is true, it's not true, we know. But if it were true, it would weaken what the person says. So, yeah, we'll accept that. Very few mainstream English language novels have historically been set in American and European. No. Well, very clearly, if that is true, then it defeats the author's argument. Because the author's argument is that they are typically centered on America and Europe. They don't bother about the Indian Ocean area. And if this is true, then that also weakens the author's argument, right? So, if that is true. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by a post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past. No, the fact is the person says it's not just nostalgia. It's a recognition that there has always been a whole set of interconnectedness, a whole area of interconnectedness between the countries in the Indian Ocean area. And it's not just about an idyllic past. An idyllic past would actually be very perfect. The person recognized that the past actually is good in some places, but bad in some places. Slavery, lack of freedom, and so on and so forth. So the point is, if it was true that the depiction of Africa is driven by this nostalgia and idyllic past, that would also in some sense weaken the passage's claim. Because the passage claims that actually the history has been rich, and it is actually true that it's not just nostalgia. It's not just people wishing that the past would come back because it was such a wonderful past. But if this was true, then it would defeat what the person is saying. But you realize we are actually looking at something that is, in other words, these 3 statements are counter to what the claim is. And if they are true, then the claim comes down. This one is not counter to what the claim is. This is what the claim actually is. But the claim here is about the fact that while it doesn't talk about the areas, if you say most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and adventure, that is what the passage tells us. And so if it is true, it's what the passage says. So it doesn't weaken the passage's claim. So 1 does not weaken the passage's claim. Okay.